Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Erin Quade. I'm a senior advisor at Gender Justice. I use she, her pronouns. And we are gathered here today to talk about our wonderful, beautiful, huge, historic, unanimous decision in Cooper v. USA Powerlifting, or USAPL, as you'll hear it abbreviated to a lot. We're going to talk about the case and the decision and what this means. But I do want to have my co-panelists just to introduce themselves before we start yammering about the law. So, Chris, I'm going to come to you first.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Mosier. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm a white person with short brown hair and an incredible brown curly mustache. Today, wearing a reddish sweater and sitting in front of a gray background. I am the founder of transathlete.com, and I am an out trans athlete tracking policies for the last about 15 years.
Thank you. And it is an incredible mustache, can confirm.
Thank you.
Jess, will you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Jess Braverman. I'm the legal director at Gender Justice. I kind of fit Chris's description, except I do not have an awesome mustache. So I'd say that's how people tell us apart. They're like, which one's Chris and which one's Jess? Mustache. And yeah, I'm the legal director. I've been with Gender Justice since 2019, and I'm also one of the attorneys who represented JC Cooper.
Awesome. Thank you. So, yesterday was the big decision from the Minnesota Supreme Court on Cooper v. USA Powerlifting. And the decision was unanimous. It was historic. It just, held and reaffirmed some fundamental bedrock principles of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. It not only affirmed the rights of transgender athletes to fully participate in sports, but also affirmed their dignity and place in our society. Gender Justice took this case back in 2019 with our co-counsel Nichols Castor, Schlesinger PLLC, and Primo Frank, because we knew even then that there was a growing, unprecedented legal, legislative, and messaging campaign that was being orchestrated by anti-LGBTQ hate groups to deny trans people basic rights and dignity and push them out of society altogether. And so this case was always about our client, JC, who I just cannot sing praises enough. She has been going through this since 2019, and because of her perseverance, because of her willingness to come forward and say, hey, this was wrong, all trans people in the state of Minnesota in places of public accommodations are protected from discrimination. That is just a tremendous thing for a person to do, and she really did that. And we know in Minnesota, we've been a leader in advancing justice. We're a proud trans refuge state. We have one of the oldest human rights acts in the country. We've long had one of the most, if not the most inclusive. And this is happening amid a national landscape that's increasingly hostile to trans people. And so we know our state is often providing hope and support for folks. And so we are gathered to explain the win and talk about the win, but also celebrate. There is not a ton that we can celebrate day in, day out, especially when it comes to celebrating the wonderful presence of trans people in our lives, our state, our country, our society. And so today is one of those days, and that is a truly awesome thing. So I'm going to turn it over to Jess to just talk about, do you want me to provide more prompts than I did last time? I can do that, Jess, or do you want to just go in the flow?
Prompt me when if I sound like a lawyer, be like, Jess, you sound like a lawyer, and I'll read it.
Jess, you sound like a lawyer.
Yes, and it'll redirect me.
Okay, well, let's start with, tell us just a little bit about this case, what happened, and let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm gonna start the story in the 90s. I was listening to K-Rock, playing Doom on my desktop PC, and Minnesota was passed the first human rights law at the state level directly protecting, like expressly protecting transgender people. So our anti-discrimination law looks different than a lot of other ones you'll see because ours specifically includes transgender people. Ones that don't have that explicit language in it, courts also sometimes say those do protect transgender people. So it's not that. It's like ours has it in there. Like it's undeniable. And so that was back in the 90s. So that's pretty cool. So JC Cooper is a power lifter, and she applied to join USA Powerlifting. She got a membership card to compete in the female category. She's a woman, and everything was fine until it came time for her to sign up for some competitions. USAPL found out that she was transgender and said, like, we do not allow transgender athletes to compete in any women's events, period. In other words, they had a policy of banning transgender women from women's events. JC tried to advocate for herself, and right now it seems like there's a lot of like the voices who oppose trans inclusion in sport are so loud, but like she had a ton of supporters. There was an entire team of powerlifters who were like, this is wrong, what are you doing? And so she had a lot of support. USAPL dug in their heels, would not let her compete. And so she came to us and we filed a complaint with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. That's a local agency here in Minnesota that investigates human rights complaints. That case was there for a while. They were investigating it. In 2021, we pulled the case out of the department and brought it to court instead because we said, like, this happened a while ago. I think we need to move on this. And so we did. And so we brought a lawsuit under the Minnesota Human Rights Act suing USA Powerlifting for discriminating against JC based on the fact that she's transgender. So far, Erin, does that sound like a normal way of explaining? Do I sound like a lawyer? You're on mute.
Sure am. I said, no, you don't sound like a lawyer. You sound like me.
Oh, wow. High
yeah,
praise. High praise.
The highest praise I could give somebody. No, you're doing really great.
I look like Chris and I sound like Erin. Like, what a dream. What a dream of a day we're having here.
That's the ideal person. We filed the case. Keep going. You were great. You're doing perfectly.
Okay. So we brought two different claims. So our human rights law is this like incredible law. It has protections in employment, in education, in real estate. It's just tons of different protections. Housing,
public services, and public accommodations.
Yeah, correct. And so we brought two different claims. We said you discriminated against JC in public accommodations and you discriminated against JC in business. These are kind of two separate claims that come with their own statutory sections, right? Like there's certain rules for one type of claim, certain rules for another type of claim. We just brought them both, which is a really common thing that lawyers do. You say, like, what laws did they break? Here's a list of them. We're gonna, put them all in the complaint and go because, like, you definitely broke a law here. This case moved through the courts for years. Our judge, our trial judge, meaning the first judge that we saw, in this case, ruled in our favor. He issued a really fiery ruling basically saying Minnesota protects transgender people from discrimination, and we mean what we said. Like, this is what the law says. I'm going to apply the law to this case. Clearly, you discriminated. USA Powerlifting appealed. It went to the next court, which was the Court of Appeals, and then it went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. And that's where this case ends. It does not go to the US Supreme Court. It ends with the Minnesota Supreme Court. And just yesterday, the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled in our favor and said that USA Powerlifting discriminated against JC Cooper. That's the ruling, period. There's some confusion if you've read any media accounts of the ruling. The press keeps getting what happened wrong. So I'm just telling you, like, at some point they're not going to be able to deny this win. Like, we straight out won the case. As I mentioned, there's two different laws we sued under: public accommodations and business. They have their own separate tracks. We straight up won on public accommodations. We only need to win on one of them to win the case. We won on the public accommodations claim. It is illegal in the state of Minnesota for places of public accommodation to discriminate against transgender people. That's sports organizations, that's restaurants, that's movie theaters, that's hospitals. That covers a wide range of public life. So this ruling is huge. It goes beyond sports, and we're just absolutely thrilled.
Can I ask, Jess?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Please
because of
ask.
this ruling, does USA Powerlifting have to change?
Yes, USA Powerlifting will absolutely have to change their policy or they cannot operate in Minnesota. That's another source of confusion, is that they are saying they don't. And so you're going to hear a lot of conflicting things. They're not grounded in reality. They lost and they are going to have to change their policy. We just haven't reached that point in the case yet. The case has to go back down to the first judge. And so that's where we're going back to, so that he can decide what the next steps are in the case, which are like how they have to change their policy, how much money they have to pay, and that sort of thing. And so the case in that sense is going to continue, but USA Powerlifting discriminated against JC, and nothing in this case is going to change that. They're what's called liable to her for discrimination, meaning they've been found to have broken the law, and that's not going to change.
Yes. And so I really appreciate that clarification. I think that's what's really important, and we will continue to do our work to make sure that reporters who aren't lawyers understand that, because the ruling, and I say this with all the love for all of the Minnesota Supreme Court justices who were authors of this opinion, was not written for lawyers who don't practice in Minnesota and practice human rights law. Like, you know, if you or I, well, there's lawyers in this room, but if I read this, if Chris read this, we would be like, yay, which is how a lot of people read it. And lawyers who do this work would be like, yay, right? So that's what we're taking away from it, is full on yay. I want to come to you, Chris, before, and I do see the questions. I do want to lift up something that was brought out, because Jess, you did say that, you know, JC had a lot of support from her peers in powerlifting, and a supporter here said that those lifters who protested in favor of JC were banned for life from USA powerlifting events. And so just a huge shout out to them for standing up for their teammate, their colleague, their peer in this space, and standing up for what's right, even though they suffered immense consequences for that. Being banned for life is not nothing.
And there is this other component of this case that didn't get much discussion in the court ruling, and that's because to win a case like this, you don't have to prove that the other side is like hateful or spiteful or filled with animus. You don't have to prove that to win. However, we did have evidence of that, and USA Powerlifting referred to all those people who supported JC. What they said about them was that they were not beaten enough as children. They're like children who had temper tantrums in Walmart, and now they're still screaming, and their parents didn't beat them enough. And so if there's any question, like, is this really about like fairness in sport or something else? Like that's just one example of what they said while discussing these policies, while discussing. So I feel like they're gonna have to change their policies, they're gonna have to pay, but I don't like the idea of letting them get away with like we're just this good faith group that's trying to figure out fairness in sport, because that's just not true at all.
I appreciate you bringing that up. And Chris, I'm sure you can expand on that, and also just talk about what, you know, the human impact of, you can talk about exclusionary policies, or what the human impact of this win is.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to join you to celebrate Minnesota's historic ruling on trans athletes. And I want to, share a little bit more about the meaning and impact that this has on trans athletes like myself and the trans community. I think it's important to call out that this landmark victory is not only a win for the people in Minnesota. I think it really can show other states with good human rights laws what is possible to protect all athletes while we try to foster a more successful and thriving team environment. Because I think that the shocking truth that most people miss about this topic is this: excluding trans athletes doesn't protect fairness. It actually creates more dangerous spaces for everyone in sports. Because when we block certain people from participating authentically, we damage the entire foundation of what sports is really supposed to represent. And that's why I think that this case is so major, because for so many people in the queer community, so many transgender and non-binary people, sport actually is a safe space. It's a place where we can explore our gender. It's a place where we can find community, we can find purpose, and most of all, we can have fun. And I think that that's lost on a lot of people when we're having this conversation about inclusion in sports. It's really in these spaces that we have the opportunities to get to know people that we probably wouldn't ever meet or spend time with outside of our sport. And we know that one of the key values to sport is teamwork. And teamwork means caring about other people. And really, nothing helps us learn that. Like, nothing helps prepare us more to use that idea in the workplace or in our neighborhoods or in our communities than sport. So, sport helps us build those skills as well as those lifelong friendships that we all need. And I would say that those examples of the powerlifters who stood up for JC is a great example of those lifelong friendships that are formed through seeking a common goal. And the research backs this up. So research consistently shows that affirming and supporting teams perform better when every athlete can show up as their true and authentic self. So teams that embrace diversity don't just win at inclusion, they win more games too, right? So as a result, our teams and our communities become stronger. And that's really what this is about. Sports can help us build bridges in ways that few other things can. So this case really matters as a trans person and as a trans athlete because there has been a strategic coordinated attempt to paint trans people as a danger in sports so that they can say that we are a threat everywhere else. We've seen this from sports being an entry point to discrimination in healthcare and our travel documents and school curriculum and so many other areas of public life. But that narrative completely ignores the science and it ignores the lived experience of thousands, like literally thousands of cisgender athletes who compete alongside trans teammates every single day. And over 2,000 athletes and coaches have already stood up for inclusion this week as a part of an open letter released by Gender Justice in coordination with this case. So I want to call attention to that because that's huge. We don't often see the supportive people. We don't often hear the supportive voices, because that's not clickbait media, right? So we want to make sure to highlight and uplift those voices and say that, this is a ruling that reminds us that sports should be about bringing people together, not about creating arbitrary divisions that literally hurt everyone. So this is a really significant moment for transgender people in sports. And it's really a launch pad, I hope, for the people who have been tracking this case for the last 6 years. I think powerlifting is not necessarily an endurance sport, but being in this lawsuit absolutely was an endurance event for JC, and we're just so grateful as the trans community and transgender athletes that she has had the endurance and strength and courage to fight for not only her ability to participate authentically, but for everyone in Minnesota to have that same opportunity. And I'm just thrilled to see that Minnesota has been leading the way by unanimously affirming that trans people belong.
I want to entice you to move to Minnesota, Chris.
It's on my list, really.
Good.
You are
Okay,
crushing
great.
it.
And really, truly, I mean, so since Chris is here, and please forgive me for talking about you while you're sitting here, but Chris has been an incredible supporter of JC and of this case and of the movement since the day we filed this case. And I will say there were people in the national movement that told us not to do it. And so there were people who were like, oh, good luck. And Chris was like, I'm in, what can I do? And at every step of the way has connected us to athletes and connected us to advocates, has connected us with the real world impact. It might shock some of you, but I am no longer an athlete. I am, and I'm certainly not a professional one. I think amateur would be pushing it at this point. And so that is not a space that I'm connected to it's not a space I'm connected to for fun. I'm connected to it for work. And Chris is an incredible athlete, an incredible trainer and advocate, and just an all around amazing person with an incredible mustache. And so I just cannot thank you enough, Chris, for all of your work to get us here as well. We've thanked our co-counsel a lot, but you have been a key part of this team, and I'm grateful for you. Thank you for that. We've got a few questions, and if you have questions, folks, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we can make sure those get answered. But let's start with one that we've heard before. We'll continue to hear it, and it's a great question. How do you think this will impact youth athletics? The person asking works in education law and sees a growing number of anti-trans issues in high schools, especially.
That's a great question and a really important and timely one. So the Minnesota Human Rights Act does prohibit discrimination in education settings. The language of that provision looks a lot like the public accommodations provision, to the point where I think someone would have a hard time convincing the court that you should read those two things differently. And a non-lawyer way to say that is that the win was maybe in the public accommodations context, but I don't see any reasonable argument that it wouldn't also apply to schools. And so I think that this is a clear mandate that schools have to be trans inclusive in sports. Minnesota also has protections for trans students. We brought a case with the ACLU and Stinson law firm back that was decided, I want to say in 2019 or 2020, the ruling came down finding that the Minnesota Constitution and the Minnesota Human Rights Act protects trans students from discrimination. And so Minnesota does protect students. Not all youth athletics are through schools. There's Little League, that sort of thing. They're considered places of public accommodation typically. And so those are covered just clearly under this ruling. And so this is a pretty wide-ranging ruling that applies to, like, I would say it applies to most recreational sports groups.
And I do want to add too that, you know, the Minnesota State High School League has been inclusive, trans inclusive for more than a decade. And so that is the policy of this state of Minnesota and has been for a while. And so, you know, one of the things that has been happening is people treat the inclusion of trans people in sports as if it's like an open question, like, what should we do now that it's a thing all of a sudden? And the answer is it's been a thing for a very long time. We've already figured that out. It's not an open question, asked and answered. Thank you so much. Let's work on something real like ending hunger. So that is, you know, something to know as well. Like, even though some people want to treat it like it's a new problem that needs to be solved, it's not a problem. And we've already figured out how to be inclusive in athletics and a lot of other spaces in the state of Minnesota. Chris, is there anything you want to add? So the next question, this is juicy and meaty, Jess, I know you love it. What does this ruling mean for collegiate trans athletes? After Trump signed the executive order, the NCAA barred trans women from participating in women's sports. So Minnesota universities were faced with the dilemma of either violating state law or violating federal. I want to say an EO is not federal law, I'll just say that, but federal something, and then NCAA regulations. Does this ruling provide any clarity for people continuing to face this dilemma? It's a really good question.
Yeah, so Trump did sign his executive order, but as Erin said, it's not, to say it doesn't have the force of law is kind of a vague, so I'm trying to figure out like a way to put this, but basically Title IX is the main law that prohibits discrimination in school settings. Title IX, most courts that have been asked, like, what is Title IX, what does it mean, have determined that Title IX protects transgender students from discrimination. An executive order cannot change that because the president does not interpret federal law, like he cannot interpret federal law differently from how a court does. Once a court rules on something, that's it. We're about to get a ruling from the US Supreme Court this next session about whether Title IX does in fact protect transgender students from discrimination. But right now, I would say there is no conflict between state and federal law. They both mandate trans inclusion, but some people disagree about how to interpret federal law. We will have that answer soon. In terms of colleges in Minnesota have to be trans inclusive. The U of M is a government, like the Board of Regents is a public board. Like they're also bound by the Minnesota Constitution. The University of Minnesota should not be, for example, should not be discriminating against transgender athletes or transgender students. There's also a really interesting question about the NCAA and whether they are even part of Title IX. They've argued in the past that they're not. And so if they're not, then I would tell them when you're operating in Minnesota, you have to follow Minnesota law, no matter what Title IX says, if you don't even think you're covered under Title IX. So I think this is like a really interesting question of what this means for collegiate trans athletes. But I would say for the most part, they should not be discriminated against in Minnesota colleges. And so I think but I think that was even true before this ruling. But this ruling kind of cements that even more.
Thanks, Jess. The next question is, how might this impact other powerlifting federations that operate in Minnesota?
Yeah, so it would apply to them. If you operate events in Minnesota, if you have membership in Minnesota, then you are like, if you're a national governing body, or if you're a sports league, recreational, whatever it may be, you are subject to the Minnesota human rights law. And so other powerlifting federations will also have to be trans inclusive.
And correct me if I'm wrong, and this might be more for Chris, but that's, that's not necessarily a new concept. Like there are types of athletics that, in one country there's these rules, in another country there's not. And so they're used to following rules in multiple places, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I would say for some sports, there's even multiple rules depending on your age or your level of play, right? So our youth sport rules are different than our Olympic and Paralympic and professional rules. And that makes sense because the purpose of sport is different for those levels of play. But we do see different rules in different sports, different rules in different countries. So it is a patchwork, but sports organizations are very well equipped to handle all of those sort of details.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the question du jour, explain how the press is misunderstanding the decision, Jess.
Yeah, so we brought two different claims, a public accommodations claim and a business claim. And in the law, they run on two separate tracks. So sometimes there's exclusions in the law, sometimes there's defenses in the law. Those defenses and exclusions are different in each context. And so the public accommodations provision has no defenses or exclusions. USAPL just lost on that claim. They've discriminated. They have a facially discriminatory policy, meaning a policy that says like you cannot participate based on your membership in a protected class, in this case, transgender people. That's just illegal under a public accommodations law. And that's all we really need to win the case. Separate from that is our business claim. In any business discrimination case, someone can say, like, there's a provision in there that says, like, you cannot discriminate in business unless you have a legitimate business purpose. That's true in every single business discrimination case. And so, what the question is, will USAPL get to argue that they have a legitimate business purpose? And if they win on that, what does it mean? The answer to the first question, will they have the opportunity to make that argument, is we'll have to see, because it's our case and it's our claim. So for example, we could just choose to withdraw it. We don't need to go forward on it because we already won. And I don't want to waste the court's time. I don't want to waste anyone's time. And so it might just not be worthwhile at this point to pursue it because we won the case. It doesn't matter. The way USAPL and others and the media is spinning it is that if they say they have a legitimate business purpose, then they win the case, and that's simply not true. It only applies to one of two claims, and we don't need that second claim to win the case. We've already won it under a much broader law that is much more meaningful, which is the public accommodations provision, because business discrimination is about, like, it's just so limited that I was struggling to even think of what would be a business that doesn't fall under any of the other categories in the Minnesota Human Rights Act, and I was really struggling to find one. Public accommodations is like everywhere that the public goes. And so what the media is misunderstanding is that the case is effectively over. USA is liable to JC for discrimination, and nothing that happens from this day forward will change that.
Yeah, if I could also just add, so essentially what the media is, the perception I think that they have taken away and been given in some cases by USAPL is that, like, we won one and USAPL won one, so it's kind of a wash, and we'll have to go to trial and see who actually wins. The reason I asked the question at the top, does USA Powerlifting have to change? The answer is yes. And so I think the press saw, sending that business claim back to the lower court, if we decide to continue to pursue that discrimination claim, as like they sent the case to, and there was like a partial win. So that's how the press is misunderstanding it. And I will say that the statements USA Powerlifting have made really leans into that. So like they've said, like, we'll get to prove to a jury why we need to do this. And one, they only get to go in front of a jury if our client says, I would like to continue to pursue that claim. And two, so they've acted like that they have the power to do that, that's not their thing. And it's just a very interesting like misunderstanding of the case, but we're working with the press to help them understand it. The opinion was not written for lay people. It was written for lawyers in Minnesota who practice human rights law. And that is where a lot of the confusion is coming in. And it's not willful, it's just happening. So we'll continue to try to clear that up. And I hope that was the right answer, or that made sense to folks. We spent so much time explaining how they're wrong. Like, I feel like we're having a hard time explaining how they're being wrong. You're muted, Jess.
I think what you're saying, Erin, is that we don't even have to pursue that claim anymore. And even if we did, and even if they won, it wouldn't change the fact that we won the case because they are a public accommodation and they discriminated. So it kind of is neither here nor there what happens with that claim.
Yes. I'm going to come to, well, this actually tacks onto this. USAPL has said at a national governing body meeting that it will pursue this case up until SCOTUS if it needs to. Do you know if USAPL has any path to do that?
They do not. This is a state law issue. There's no federal component to it. There's other ways to get into federal court, but they already tried and failed to do that. No, this is not a case that gets reviewed by SCOTUS.
Love that answer. Let's see. Okay, so there's a few questions in here that are more specific to like some specifics about trans people in sports, and I might kind of lump them together. But and I'm going to come to this last question about propelling public support because I think it's a really good place to end. So there's a few questions in here about like, is there science that negates this often said talking point that, you know, trans women have testosterone, so they're bigger and they're stronger, and so it's unfair when they're competing with their cis women peers. And then a little bit of questions about like, did the decision distinguish anything about trans athletes competing or participating before or after puberty?
So on the puberty question, no, the decision does not distinguish in that way. In terms of like the so-called science, so just to be clear, there is no, I have yet to read a scientific report that says that trans women have an advantage over cis women in sports. There's a lot of efforts to say that that's what science says, but I had to read so many scientific reports to litigate this case, and not a one of them came to that conclusion based on like comparing cisgender and transgender women athletes. USA Powerlifting's so-called science was based on studies involving like mice, cisgender kids, adults who are not athletes, Black women. There was a study that Black women have an advantage in sport because they have greater hip density than white women. You know, it's stuff like that, but there was no study saying that in the sport of powerlifting, trans women have some sort of advantage. There's, you know, the science is really in dispute, and we could have like a whole week-long conference on science, but you know, I always direct people to the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sports. They have a great report kind of laying out the issues with the so-called science in this area. And they're more experts in that than I am. The other thing I just always note is that discrimination is dangerous. Discrimination leads to a lot of physical and mental harm, which is the exact opposite of what sports are supposed to provide to people. Sports are inherently unfair. We make up rules and decide like these are the rules for that sport. And so if you think about school sports, you have kids who don't have school lunch. They go to school without breakfast. They go to school without lunch. They have to like work at night to help there's so many different ways that people have advantages or disadvantages in sport. The idea that it all comes down to like the bodies we were born into and nothing else is just simply untrue. So we could spend like a whole day talking about it. I would, the research, Chris put it in the link. I would encourage folks to go there and look. But if you're looking for like quick, pithy responses. We do have like a trans equity training where we discuss some of those things as well.
I do also want to note that because we're talking about anti-discrimination law or protection from discrimination, the justices actually asked some really insightful questions based on essentially what USA Powerlifting was asking them to do. So, they presented their evidence and this, trans women are stronger and they're bigger, and so therefore it's unfair. And so one of the justices said, okay, so if a law firm, because keep in mind, this is the Minnesota Human Rights Act, and the way that it is sectioned out is that it says, in places of employment, you're protected from discrimination on the basis of race, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and it lists all of these things. So none of these protected characteristics are separate from one another. They're all contained in the same statute where you're protected and then what characteristic is protected. And so in places of public accommodation, obviously race is one of those. And so the justice asked, so if a law firm said it wasn't going to hire Black lawyers because statistically Black lawyers do worse on the bar exam than their white peers, that would be okay. Because essentially USA Powerlifting was saying, well, we are discriminating, but we have a good reason for it. And it's this data, this science. And a different justice asked, okay, so if there was a bowling league and they wouldn't let Catholics participate on it because they had data that said Catholics are really good at bowling for some inexplicable reason, you would want that to be legal. And the reason I bring that up is because it is not possible to create exceptions in discrimination law for just one protected characteristic because they all go together. So if we create an exception to say, well, yes, you can discriminate against trans women in sports because insert this data, that is going to be an exception then that opens the door for exceptions to all of the other protected characteristics in our Minnesota human rights law. And that, I just want to point out, is why the anti-LGBTQ hate groups are using trans women as a wedge issue to distract people from the overarching goal, which is to eliminate protections from discrimination for every protected characteristic that has ever existed. So before we get too far into the science, there has always been scientific reasons to discriminate against people, Black people, Jewish people, women, you name it, it's existed. But the reason why it's illegal is because it's discrimination. And even if it's a, unfavored grouping of people at some point in history, it doesn't make it okay. And in fact, it allows for more discrimination. Jess, I hope that in my non-lawyer way, I've really explain that accurately.
I also it's hard for me to just skip over the second part of the question was and the maxim that trans women on a team increase physical risk to other players. That one always gets me because there's absolutely no data supporting that whatsoever. But also sports without trans athletes, it's just have you ever looked at concussion statistics in high school football and high school soccer? Sports are actually really just dangerous for kids.
They're dangerous. Yes.
And it has absolutely nothing to do one way or the other with trans inclusion. I have heard the most gnarly injuries in high school sports, and I've yet to hear I've yet to hear any data that this is a greater risk or the injuries are greater when trans athletes compete. So I think it's also important to keep in mind just because people say something because to them it sounds like common sense, that doesn't make it true. And so I think it's also worth just unpacking some of these assumptions we're making that aren't even supported by any data.
And also size and strength don't necessarily equal, physical risk or prowess in a sport. My brother played hockey for a really long time. He is, kind of compact, I guess you could say. He's not little, but especially when we were in high school, he was kind of a teeny guy, and he loved playing against bigger players because they were slower. He could get around them faster and he could go faster than they could, right? Because he was smaller. And so size and strength don't equate the same things. He would have maybe gotten railed on the, football field if he was playing football, but in hockey, it really served him well. Same goes for agility and eyesight and all of these things. So it depends on the sport. It depends on the person. There's different strengths and different things. And so the physical risk, it doesn't always equate to someone bigger than you. Sometimes that's actually safer. So Chris, you're an athlete. Would you like to add anything to this conversation?
Also, the offensive coverage, Chris is a Team USA athlete. And the offensive coverage I've read about you as an athlete, if you don't mind, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just people are it's just so ridiculous. They erase trans male athletes. And would you mind just talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I am, here as a supporter of JCs and as an ally to trans women, and I have to be because in terms of the sports battle, that they have been the targets. Trans men and trans masculine athletes and non-binary athletes have been completely overlooked in this conversation, and that's by design. Since I came out in 2010 and since I first made Team USA in 2015, the general, response to that has been a shrug and okay, well, he probably won't do it again. I'm now a 8-time member of Team USA, a 5-time men's national champion, a men's All-American, and still it's a shrug because I don't fit the narrative that trans people, are not able to play sports, or that trans people, or that anyone assigned female at birth would be unable to participate in sports, right? So at the root of this is this deeply sexist, misogynistic, transmisogynistic, patriarchal idea that anyone assigned male at birth will be bigger, faster, stronger, and a better athlete than anyone assigned female at birth. And so, my story, I just competed in a world championship. I became, I was 12th place and the top American man in my group. And it's a shrug for people because it doesn't support this idea that trans people are dangerous or that we are unable to be good teammates and good leaders. This idea is so far from the truth. And, I think that focus on trans women specifically is that deeply sexist, misogynistic, and overlapping racist, because these policies deeply impact trans women of color and our athletes from the global South. I think that you both covered very well the science pieces and this idea that size and strength and like safety in sports, we're sort of thinking about this in completely the wrong way. It's not that you're bigger and therefore a better athlete. We all know cisgender men who are of any size who are terrible at sports, right? So but we forget about that conveniently when we're having this conversation about who could be a good athlete, who belongs on the field of play, and how we can work together to coexist as teammates to get the very best out of sports. Because what really matters at the end of the day is not the wins and losses, it's not the records, it's about showing up and being there with your team. And this is primarily what we're talking about is our youth athletes and our recreational adult athletes. Those are primarily who makes up sports. The possibilities of being an elite athlete, a professional athlete, an Olympian or Paralympian are so small. So what we're really talking about here is people moving their bodies together and having fun. And we have to keep that as the end goal and the sight, in our North Star when we're having this conversation, because it deeply impacts our just adults who want to do the softball league after work and have fun with their friends. It's impacting the recreational hockey player who has loved the sport since they were a kid and just wants to play with some teammates, or the kid who's learning about themselves and learning about teamwork and communication and dedication and goal setting. And, we have to make sure that every American has those opportunities. And Minnesota has created a great place for that to start.
And I would argue part of why we have such high rates of participation in sports in Minnesota, because we're inclusive. So this is a good segue into, and Chris, I just love what you're talking about too. 80% of Americans age 6 or older participate in a sporting event every year, like themselves. And so this is a very American thing that we do. Okay, so there's 2 questions about kind of, youth sports, one in schools and then one in kids clubs. So real quick, Jess, are kids club sports not MSHSL governed by national federations also obligated to be inclusive of trans athletes because of this decision?
Sports organizations that operate in Minnesota, that have memberships to Minnesota, that hold events in Minnesota, do have to be inclusive.
Yep. And then what about school board members in Minnesota that are trying to ban trans athletes? Do we still need more signatures from school board members supporting us on the letter? Or hopefully that issue may sort of go away now? I'm here to tell you that issue is not going to go away. Yes, we need more school board members to sign on to the letter. And also, school boards can't ban trans athletes from participating in sports. They cannot. It is policy of the Minnesota State High School League to be trans inclusive. There have been numerous court decisions that have talked about not discriminating against trans kids in school. Sports is still part of school. It's not like you leave the physical building of school and participate on your school's athletic team, and that, you know, it's no longer sports. And they run a very serious risk of lawsuit if they try to go that route. There have already been school districts that have tried to discriminate against trans kids. It has been very expensive, and they lose every single time. And at a time when property taxes are going up, at a time when school budgets are facing shortfalls, this is not like paying for discriminating against a trans kid is something a district will have to do. They could just not do that and be inclusive. That would be what I would say, Jess.
I think that's a great answer. Yes.
Okay, great. So these last two questions, has there been any talk, because it's been a difficult year of protests and then hateful coverage of trans people, any talk of a celebration event or a rally to celebrate this?
There might be talk. Any celebratory events, if you sign up for our email list, genderjustice.us, you could go to our website, sign up for our email list, and you'll any events that we put on, you should be able to see via email. Yeah, news coverage on trans joy. We definitely need more on that. So yeah.
And then the worry for JC, how can people support JC? Is there an address where cards can be mailed? I'm going to put my email address into the chat. And if folks want to send kind words and notes to JC, I'll compile those and send them over to her. I think all the love is good and would be much appreciated. So I'll pop my email in the chat. Or if somebody else from Gender Justice is on, is there a better way to do it? Just put that in the chat too. Either my email address or a better
the info at, and we'll put an email address in the chat. It could be info at or whatever. And if if you say this message is for JC, yeah, we can compile messages and make sure that they get to her.
If I could add one more call to action for folks, I really think that it's important in this moment in time to use this incredible decision as a launch pad for trans joy and support of our community in the public space. And so if you are reading articles and you're concerned about JC because of the comments that are out there, we as the trans community, as trans athletes, can really use people who are not trans athletes to be actively supporting us and being vocal about that support. And I know that some folks have said, it's a challenging thing to dip your toe into because, it is so highly charged and politicized in this moment in time. But what better way to do that than celebrate this incredible decision that is literally protecting everyone in Minnesota as it's intended to do. So this moment in time, this positive news coverage of this case is a great way to start to be a more vocal advocate for the trans community by sharing it and celebrating it as the win that it really is. Because, for us to constantly log on and see the negative stories, the negative messages, the negative comments, it does have a human toll. At the end of the day, you have to remember that as trans athletes, we are still people. And I think that a lot of the humanity of the trans community has been lost in the conversations that we've been having in the last 2 to 5 years as the trans people in sports conversation has escalated to what it is today. So I really would just want to call on you to openly and actively express your support. And a great way to do it is by sharing the positive news about this incredible unanimous decision in Minnesota. And, and also by tapping into Gender Justice's newsletter and following their calls to action around this, because this is just a starting point. And I hope as a trans athlete and a person advocating for trans inclusion in sports and beyond, that more of this can happen with the great example that Minnesota has set, that more of these types of suits and decisions are able to ripple across the country to really help sweep that positive change that we need to see, so that we can create a world where, if fairness really is something that we are concerned about, this topic of who is allowed in sport is no longer a question.
Beautiful. Well, that's a perfect, even it was a perfect answer in and of itself to the last question, but it's, I guess, a perfect segue, because it's how can we use this moment to propel public support forward for trans people, kids, athletes. I feel like some people have held back from public support, and this ruling feels like an opportunity. So Chris outlined a bunch of really good things to do, right? Show your public support for trans people, trans athletes, and JC. Gender Justice does trans equity trainings, and we'll have someone put the link to that into our chat, and you can join those. And there's actions that stem from those trans equity trainings as well. There is a letter for school board members to sign on in support of trans student athletes. If you are a school board member, sign on. If you're not, send it to your school board members and get them to sign on as well. We have our trans equity training is coming up in November. So that is on that. We have a toolkit on trans inclusion in sports. Someone can pop that in the chat as well. And we also have a brunch coming up in November. And it's the whole conversation is about like the actual issues in women's sports and things that we should actually be talking about when it's threats to sports. And so we have Laisha Clarendon and Ashland Johnson from Inclusion Playbook who will be joining us for that conversation. For any lawyers, it will be a continuing education credit. For any non-lawyers, it'll be very wonderful conversation. It's at the Guthrie. And there's more information that was just popped into the chat there. It's going to be beautiful. What is better than brunch at the Guthrie? I mean, my goodness. And then, you know, you can support this work, joining our email list, following us on socials, donating and supporting Gender Justice. We are a legal nonprofit. We've always punched above our weight, but really, truly, like, Jess and I have spent our entire career at Gender Justice trying to get funding to do our trans inclusion work. And it comes from like the big funders. And so this really is work that is entirely supported and sustained through what we can raise from our supporters, from our allies, and it takes a lot. And we have just notched incredible wins for trans people in Minnesota over the course of 6 years. And to continue doing that, Gender Justice needs to be here. It needs to be supported, and we would appreciate all the support there.
And
Go ahead,
also 2 other things. One is we are accepting applications for our board. So there's board recruitment going on right now. You could check out our website for more information, but those applications I believe are due tomorrow. So this would be like a last minute thing, but that is still out there. The other thing that I've learned since working here is I used to think like my elected officials don't care what I think, like why should I write to them? This session is going to be a rough one. There's going to be a lot of focus on policies involving trans athletes, trans students. We're going to need you to be really, really loud and tell your friends to be really, really loud this year because there is just going to be a lot going on. And they do listen. They do hear what you have to say. So,
Chris, any final closing thoughts, remarks? Thank you so much for being here with us.
No, thank you for having me. And just thank you to your team, Gender Justice, and your partner lawyers for lawyering. These sort of things really do make a difference. And, you know, not just for the state of Minnesota, this is a huge win for everyone in Minnesota, but also nationally, you know, people across the country are looking to see the outcome of this case. And we really needed this win. And so we're just really grateful for the work that you've done. Grateful to JC for having the endurance and strength and courage to stick it out, to put herself on the line for our community. And just grateful for everyone who has taken an interest in this case, for all of you tuning in and joining today, asking for ways that you can activate. It really does make a difference. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the beautiful fall weather wherever you may be. We will hope to see you soon, and especially at our brunch. Come join us. Bye, everybody.